In a dark corner of an upscale restaurant, with soft lights and exquisite food, a story begins that makes your soul chill. The chef, a hardened racist, looked with contempt at anyone who didn't feed his narrow-minded views, and when a young girl, sophisticated, proud and beautiful, entered the restaurant that evening, his face contorted with anger. Her calmness and dignity made him angry. He had no idea that behind her smile was a serious force. Her father, the chief judge, the man who could reverse any injustice and stand up for the truth. With hatred in his heart and fierce determination, he slipped the poison into her dish. His hands trembled not from fear but from anticipation. He did not know that this mistake of his would be a total disaster for him. With each step that brought the waiter closer to the girl's table, the tension grew. We watch every moment, holding our breath. Perhaps he thinks this is his little revenge, but the truth has an agenda, and retribution is closer than he can imagine. Guys, let's stop for a second. Please write in the comments what your name is and where you're watching us from. Each and every one of you is incredibly important to us. I create these stories for you, and your support makes our channel come alive. Each of your comments, each of your hearts helps us grow and tell more stories like this. Remember, you are our greatest asset. Thank you for watching and supporting us. When the clock struck 8 in the evening, there was an almost oppressive silence in the luxurious room of the Serenity restaurant. The tables were stacked with porcelain plates and crystal glasses, reflecting the soft light of the expensive chandeliers, as if the world had frowned seen here, absorbing only whispers and the light clinking of dishes. This restaurant was a prestigious place where people who were accustomed to glamour and sophistication came, but behind all that elegance there was something sinister, something that only a keen observer could detect. In one of the far corners behind the counter was the cook, Richard Graves. His face, sullen and scowling, was rarely adorned with a smile. He was a man of rigid rules and flamboyant prejudices. Years of working in the restaurant had only exacerbated his cold, arrogant attitude toward people he didn't think were worthy of elite society. He had no tolerance for those who seemed like outsiders, and his contempt was so palpable. To him, every night was like a little play where he was the lord of the kitchen, standing over all those stupid rich people. He knew his dishes were highly regarded, but he didn't care. His contempt for those who he felt didn't deserve to be here was hardly stronger than his love for his own art. Maybe you've ever been to places like this, where everything seems to speak of luxury, but behind this appearance there is a hidden threat, as if each of the workers here plays his or her own grim role. Write in the comments if you've had a similar feeling. We're always happy to hear your stories and find out where you're watching us from. You are really important to us. Each of your comments, each of your likes helps us to tell such stories and make our channel better. Subscribe to Deeple Pro to edit this document. Visit www.deeple.com/pro for more information. Richard did not yet know that this evening would be fatal for him, that his thoughtless hatred would play a cruel joke on him. At that moment, he only continued to watch the hall like a hunter waiting for his prey. Richard Graves stood in the kitchen, his hands gliding confidently across the table, chopping herbs, adding spices, preparing ingredients for the next course. He seemed calm and focused, but inside him was a seething hatred, carefully hidden under an outer mask of professionalism. Every night, he watched the guests of the restaurant faces and behavior, manners and looks, and every night he was convinced that his work was not only food, but also a subtle, almost painful game of superiority. Richard despised people who, in his opinion, did not deserve a place in this luxurious establishment. They don't understand what real taste is, he thought with barely contained disgust whenever someone with an accent or an appearance unfamiliar to him entered the restaurant. His gaze turned icy. He couldn't hide his contempt, and everyone in the kitchen knew not to touch the subject. Only a few of his colleagues knew how deep his dislike ran and what kind of views he kept in his heart. He thought back to the day his patience had been tested. A family from another country had entered the restaurant. They were warmly dressed, smiling, their voices sounding in a different language. They delighted in every dish, genuinely enjoying the evening. But Richard could hardly restrain himself from cringing at the sight of their delight. They just don't deserve to be here, he mentally told himself, feeling the aggression building up in him. He saw in them only that which made them different from the other guests. That gave him a cold, caustic hatred, like a poison building up inside him. Have you ever experienced such prejudice? Maybe you yourself have been a victim of unfair judgments or seen others judged by their looks or accent. Write in the comments. Your story and your opinion are very important to us. We want each and every one of you to know that your voice matters, and we read all of your comments, trying to honor every opinion, every endorsement. Richard felt that his hatred wasn't just a belief, it was part of his life. His way of feeling superior, his way of showing the world that he was superior. And the more he allowed himself to hate, the stronger became his desire to prove it to others, to go further than just a disgruntled look or a contemptuous sneer. That evening, which was to be a regular shift, Richard Graves noticed her as soon as she entered the hall. She was dressed with refined elegance, a dress of a noble hue emphasized her delicate features, and her posture spoke of inner dignity. She strode confidently to her desk, ignoring the glances she so easily attracted. There was something unusual about her manner, as if she knew her place in the world and felt at ease in this room where every table was a status symbol. Richard watched her from the kitchen, and his face darkened with an expression of displeasure mixed with contempt. It seemed to him that her calm confidence was almost a challenge. He felt irritation boiling up in him. The girl looked like a representative of a world Richard would never accept. Her confident gait, her looks, her accent, everything about her irritated him. Every gesture she made only intensified his underlying hatred. She was different, and that was almost an insult to him. He thought about how she'd probably grown up in a family accustomed to privilege. How easy it must be for her to get the respect he'd struggled with all his life. But it wasn't just that. He saw in her the very foreignness that made him dislike her. He couldn't tolerate her presence in his restaurant. In fact, he never knew where that hatred came from. It was an old, lingering feeling that had gradually turned into a cold, unquenchable contempt. And here she was, sitting at the elegant table, reminding him of all the people he despised and didn't want in his world. Have you ever met people who seemed to challenge you with their appearance and manners just by being around them? People to whom, for inexplicable reasons, a cold wall of dislike grows. It may be hard for you to admit it, but share your thoughts in the comments. Your sincerity helps us to build this channel, to add to our stories what is close to you. Every reaction you give is important to us. Your voice is truly heard. As the girl ordered her food, Richard already knew that her presence would not go unnoticed by him. He couldn't just continue working as if she wasn't here. He began to come up with a plan. This wasn't just a cookout, it was a confrontation. He would watch her eat a dish that would change her life forever. As the girl settled at the table, Richard felt a sudden irritation that gradually grew into something more dangerous. Her presence seemed to challenge him. Her posture, her demure smile, and her calm, confident expression all made him resent her. He noticed how the waitress leaned toward her respectfully as she took her order, and how several guests looked back at her sophistication. It was as if he confirmed his fear. Someone he despised had won everyone's attention, as if she was part of this elite world. He felt she had no right to enter. Who does she think she is? Holding back his anger, Richard thought he didn't know where he gotten so much aggression toward this girl, but the feeling was so strong that it clouded his judgment. It was as if some dark part of himself was demanding that it do something to prove to her and everyone around him that she shouldn't be here. Her appearance reminded him of all the people he thought were intruding on his world, disturbing it. Richard stealthily stepped closer to the kitchen exit so he could see it better. He couldn't even hear the voices of his coworkers, busy with their own business. All that existed for him was this girl and his own underlying rage. He knew her presence would be like a thorn in his side as long as she sat at this desk. His thoughts wavered between anger and contempt. They think they can come here and be part of our world. Unable to contain himself, he made a decision. She had to feel that she didn't belong here. A plan began to form in his head that made his heart beat faster. He knew that with this meal, she would get what he felt she deserved. Richard turned to the shelves of ingredients, his gaze stopping on one small jar hidden behind the spices. He barely touched it with his fingers, realizing what he was doing. This evening should be her lesson. She would remember it forever. And you know, friends, There are times in life when someone faces unfair hatred or scorn, and it can be scary. Maybe you, too, have had situations where you feel like you're being intentionally hurt because of who you are. Please share your stories in the comments. I really need to know what you think, because you are what makes this channel special. Your words and stories help us realize what is near and dear to us with you. Richard could almost feel the girl begin to eat the dish his message should present her. Well, his plan was simple. A little powder was enough to make her sick, to make her feel alien and vulnerable. Richard couldn't take his eyes off the girl. Her confidence, her grace, the way she held her wine glass as if she'd been a member of this luxury since birth, all of it infuriated him, to the point of shaking in his hands. He felt envy and hatred seem to eat him up from the inside out. Why did she, this stranger, allow herself to be so impeccable? Her calmness, her reserved, almost regal demeanor, irritated him so much that for a moment he almost gave himself away, shrinking behind the bar as her laughter slipped through the room. But it wasn't just laughter. To Richard, it sounded like a mockery, a challenge, a reminder of his own limits, of the life he was cut off from. Everything she represented, her status, her demeanor, even her clothes seemed not just alien to him, but hostile. Richard could not tolerate anyone who was not like him, who invaded his world. And if at first glance, his hatred was hidden behind the mask of a professional, now it was bursting out, coloring his thoughts with dark anger. He thought back to his childhood, growing up in poverty, seeing rich people drive by in luxury cars, ignoring people like him. The girl at the table embodied for him everything that had once made him feel inferior, but now he had power, at least here in the kitchen, and tonight he was going to use it. Richard was completely consumed with his hatred. He was slowly selecting the ingredients for her dish, but the process was more than just cooking. He was putting all his contempt and pain into it. He wanted every bite to be a reminder to her that she didn't belong in this world, that her confidence was an illusion. He was a cook, but at this moment he felt like a judge passing judgment. Maybe you'd have once felt that heaviness when someone looks at you with disdain, without knowing anything about your life. When someone decides to judge you by your appearance, by the way you look, or even by the way you sit at your desk. Write about it in the comments. Your stories make our channel closer and more honest. You are our inspiration, and your words mean everything to us.
Clutching the small jar of powder in his hand, Richard felt a rush of adrenaline. The only thought in his mind was that she should remember this night forever. It seemed to him that the powder was not just poison, but a message that would stay with her for the rest of her life. While the waiters were bringing the girl drinks and writing down her order, the atmosphere in the kitchen was tense to the max. Rumors were already beginning to spread among the staff. One of the waiters, passing by, whispered that the girl was not just a casual guest, but a person with influential connections, a representative of a respected family. Someone mentioned that her father held a high position in the government, but no one knew exactly who he was. Soon the entire restaurant staff knew that this girl not only had confidence and manners, but also powerful patrons. These rumors, however, only added fuel to the fire. Richard listened to the whispers with rage and sarcasm. He laughed inwardly at their fear and awe of this guest. He thought his co-workers were pathetic and naive. They are willing to please her just because she has family status behind her. Fools, he thought, all of them. Richard was convinced that he was the only one who saw the real her, who understood that behind her looks and connections lay the same, as he called himself, foreign blood, unworthy of these honors. The waiters, unaware that Richard could hear their conversations, began to discuss her manners and beauty, admiring her style and confidence. They quietly exchanged opinions about how different she was from the usual customers. One of the waitresses even remarked that the girl had wisdom and strength in her eyes, which made Richard barely contain a contemptuous chuckle. In his eyes, it was a pathetic display of weakness, subservience to her origins, a desire to set herself up in front of someone who, in his opinion, didn't even deserve attention. Have you ever met people who attribute influence and importance to strangers just because of rumors or family connections? Sometimes we tend to judge people superficially, succumbing to other people's opinions. Share your thoughts in the Comments, your opinion is invaluable to us and we appreciate everyone sharing their stories. Richard clutched the jar of poison tightly, feeling the hatred increasingly clouding his mind. There was only one thing on his mind. It was time to remind her that no one here was afraid of her background and status. Her confidence and calmness made him chillingly furious. He was sure that, stripped of all that ostentatious gloss, she wouldn't be able to stand. He watched her dishes being prepared in the kitchen, and with each step her order came closer to the moment when his dark scheme would be realized. His heart pounded, as if anticipating the moment when the girl would take her first bite, and realize that not everything in this life was decided by her connections and confidence. Richard stood at the kitchen table, clutching the ingredients in his hands as if trying to suppress the rage coursing through his veins. The girl at the table in the hall seemed to him the embodiment of everything that disgusted and envied him. She, with her manners, with that unapproachable grace, with that disdainfully calm gaze, sitting in his restaurant, surrounded by attention and respect. Her presence here reminded him of his own limitations, of a life he hated but could not escape, and that made him even angrier. The thought began to gain strength in his mind, like a poison entering his consciousness, clouding his judgment. He wasn't thinking about the consequences anymore. He needed to teach her a lesson she would remember forever. He walked slowly around the kitchen, taking from the shelf the small jar he always hid, his own arsenal for special occasions. It was a dangerous seasoning he never showed or trusted to anyone. Adding it to a dish could cause a reaction, not noticeable at first glance, but strong enough to make her leave the restaurant. With her pride, with her arrogance, with her influence. Richard felt his own heart beating faster, as if he were taking part in some ritual where hatred and prejudice were turned into weapons. He knew that his actions could not be justified, but that didn't matter to him. Deep down, he felt that he was doing the right thing, that this act of revenge was his way of regaining the sense of power he felt she had taken away by her mere appearance. In his mind, the girl was no longer human. She was a symbol of everything he hated, everything he despised and wanted to destroy. Have you ever faced such a strong sense of injustice when one person, by their simplicity or pride, reminded you of the pain you have always tried to hide? That moment when your emotions cloud your judgment and it seems like there's no other way out? Tell us in the comments if you know this feeling. We appreciate each of your stories and are grateful to have you around. Richard gently mixed the poison with the seasoning, stirring carefully, as if creating a culinary creation filled with the venom of his hatred. He imagined the girl bringing the fork to her mouth, her serene face and unassailable mask beginning to crumble as she showed the first signs of malaise. It was a moment he was looking forward to. The cook headed for the serving line, holding the plate carefully, like a true craftsman, putting the finishing touches on his creation. He felt a strange joy fill him, an almost triumphant feeling. His actions seemed to him an act of justice, but a justice that only he could see. It didn't even occur to him that his hatred might have been unjustified, that this girl might not have done him any wrong. To him, it was simple. She wasn't like him, and that was enough to justify his act. Richard returned to the stove, his heart still beating so hard he could barely hear the voices around him. While the girl's dish was cooking, he tried to concentrate on his work, but his thoughts were like swirling rings of poison, rage and hatred mixed together, strengthening his resolve. However, he needed to release the accumulated aggression, and so, as one of the junior cooks passed by, he threw it at him loudly, without hiding his disdain. You know, people like her shouldn't be in here. They think they can afford anything. What they don't realize is that this place isn't for them.
The younger cook paused for a moment, stunned by Richard's words. He cast a quick glance at his older colleague, hesitant to say anything, but there was a look of concern in his eyes. The silence in response only fueled Richard's anger, and he added, lowering his voice so that everyone in the kitchen could hear him, "What does she know about real life? People like her get everything on a plate, and we're here to make them feel important. But who are they really? They're nothing." Several waiters, who happened to be nearby, frowned when they heard his words. They were surprised at his rudeness, but knowing Richard's difficult character, they preferred to keep silent. He was older, more experienced, and did not tolerate bickering. A cook's words hum in the ear like thick, heavy smoke, filling the space with an acrid, unpleasant sensation. Some looked away, others hurriedly went on with their work, pretending they hadn't heard. But that only made Richard more excited. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he felt a strange pleasure, almost like victory. The entire staff knew that he would not tolerate what he called uncleanliness in his space. To him, the kitchen was a place where he controlled everything and everyone. He didn't even notice how, wrapped up in his prejudices, he began to tower over the people around him, venting his anger. Have you ever noticed how one rude word spoken aloud changes the atmosphere, makes the air seem heavier, creates tension that cannot be ignored? Perhaps you yourself have witnessed how someone, guided by anger and hatred, shows his attitude to people it does not like. If you know this feeling or have been in the shoes of those who feel the weight of prejudice, share it with us in the comments. Your support is important to us and we appreciate every word. When the dish was ready, Richard finally brought it to the serving line, indicating to the waiter where to take it. He watched the young waiter's movements, feeling like it was directing this little tragedy. His face contorted with a grin as the waiter carried the poison dish to the girl. He wanted to see her expression, her reaction when the first bite hit her mouth. Richard stood as if on a stage, watching every moment, frowning, waiting for his dark intent to turn on her. With every step the waiter took, with every approach to the girl's table, the tension within him grew. Richard returned to his desk, his hands resting on a small glass jar of white powder, hidden among the spice jars. This powder was his secret, something no one in the kitchen knew about and that he never used. He kept it as a reminder of his power over food, as a reminder that it could create not only a delicious flavor, but something much darker if he wanted to. He stood, fingertips touching the cold glass, as if performing a ritual, immersing himself in this moment. Voices rang in his head, reminders of how he had felt since childhood, how he felt like an outsider, different from these people he now served. He hated their wealth, their manners, their quiet, sometimes arrogant demeanor. They came here as if they were at home, looking at the dishes he created with labor, with effort, as if they were a matter of course. And now there was a girl who embodied everything he despised so much. Richard carefully opened the jar, feeling a shiver of anticipation run through him. Powder was restrained but effective, and he knew he'd add just a small amount, barely noticeable but enough to make her feel sick. Perhaps she'd get dizzy, start to feel nauseous, not severe pain, but unpleasant enough to break her composure and make her leave the restaurant in worry and shame. He imagined her pale face would begin to pale, how she would realize that her confidence was only a mask, that she wasn't in control of everything in her life. Have you ever felt such a strong desire to make someone feel vulnerable, to make someone experience fear and weakness to prove your point, your strength? If such thoughts are familiar to you, share them with us in the comments. We always try to understand the depth of emotions that many people prefer not to talk about. His fingers carefully scooped up a pinch of powder, and he sprinkled it slowly over the dish as if he were adding the finishing touch to a work of art. He was sure that her status and influence made no difference against the power he possessed now. It felt like he was putting not only her in her place, but everyone who had ever allowed themselves to look down on him. He savored this moment, every moment giving himself over to the dark joy of knowing that it was the one deciding her fate. When the waiter picked up the dish to take it to the girl's table, Richard frowned, watching him. Everything that was happening around him seemed to dissolve. He heard and saw nothing else but that dish in her face, waiting for her to take the first bite. Richard watched as the dish, flavored with his hatred, gradually took shape. He acted with incredible care, trying to make it perfect, as if it were not a poison culinary creation, but a masterpiece symbolizing his victory in every detail. In the pieces of meat, in the harmonious combination of flavors, was his silent cry, his hidden rage, which was now taking shape on the plate. On the surface, everything looked perfect. The dish seemed flawless, as if intended for royalty, but beneath that thin mask of beauty lurked darkness. He decorated the plate slowly, adding the finishing touches with a care that contradicted his grim intentions. In his heart, he knew that today would finally bring justice's version of justice, where everyone got what they deserved. All this time he felt oppressed by people like her, who came in, enjoyed his labor, and then just left without noticing him. A man who put his whole soul into food, but today he was going to show her that even a man she didn't notice could change her world, make her feel vulnerable and unprotected. When the dish was finished, Richard paused to look at his work again. His gaze was cold and focused, filled with an undercurrent of pride and a kind of grim pleasure. It was his answer to her world, his answer to everyone who had ever made him feel less than. He felt that this meal was his way of permanently erasing her arrogance, her illusion of safety and invulnerability. This girl, with her arrogance and confidence, would be the victim of his justice. Have you ever felt that feeling when you do something so carefully, putting all your emotions into it because you want to prove something, especially to those who have never noticed your labor? Perhaps you've dealt with a sense of injustice that pushed you to make a decision that's hard to talk about out loud. If you have similar feelings, share them in the comments. Your opinion is important to us, and we're always willing to understand what's behind the mask. As he handed the dish to the waiter, his heart beat faster in anticipation of what was about to happen. He watched the waiter's every step, his careful movements as he carried the plate to the girl. Everything in that moment seemed to slow down like a movie, and every detail, her hand reaching for the fork, her face as she looked at the dish, was like music to him, like sweet anticipation. The waiter approached the girl's table cautiously, holding the dish as carefully as if it were made of fragile porcelain. Richard stood behind the counter, breathless, his eyes following the waiter's every movement as it placed the plate in front of the girl. There was a subdued, luxurious atmosphere in the room. The light of the lamps was soft. Muffled voices and quiet laughter of the guests only increased the tension that Richard felt with all his being. It seemed to him that the whole world had shrunk to this moment, to her first touch on his creation. She looked up at the waiter and nodded gratefully before turning her gaze back to her dish. She didn't realize that her simple smile only increased the rage and deafening hatred bubbling up inside Richard. To him, her benevolence was a display of arrogance, a confidence he didn't think she deserved. He saw in her face the insincerity, the hypocrisy, the appearance of good manners that hid the arrogance of a privileged man. It seemed to him that this girl looked down on him without even glancing in his direction. She took the fork carefully, and Richard couldn't take his eyes off her. Every gesture she made, every movement, was like a blow to his ego. He felt like a judge, not just a cook, but a judge who had passed a sentence that was about to be carried out. He had no pity for her. He had no doubts. To him she was just a symbol, a person who had to answer for everyone who had ever made him feel like a nobody. Have you ever seen a moment when one person is completely unaware that someone else harbors such dark feelings for them? A moment when one person thinks that everything around them is calm and safe, while another person is planning something terrible. Feeling of hidden threat, of underlying resentment, always sudden, always like an icy wash. Share your thoughts on this in the comments. Your opinions help us make the stories deeper and more real. The girl lifted her fork with the first bite of the dish, and Richard barely breathed. Everything he'd been waiting for was in front of him now. She brought the fork to her mouth, put the first bite on her tongue, and he waited for her face to change, for a show of discomfort to show. But nothing happened. She just kept eating, savoring every bite, as if she didn't notice anything strange. At that moment, Richard was strangely disappointed, almost angry. He wanted to see her suffer, and he wanted it to happen immediately. Her face remained calm, serene, as if she had no idea that her dish was seasoned not just with spices but with his underlying hatred. Richard could hardly contain his emotions as he watched the girl take the first bite of his special dish. He waited for something to change in her face, for her usual confidence to waver for a moment, for a hint of anxiety or discomfort to appear on her face. But she chewed calmly and even seemed to roll her eyes with pleasure, savoring the flavor as if each bite was a gastronomic delight. That pissed him off even more. He felt his anticipation replaced by a sharp, almost painful rage. Richard couldn't understand why the effect didn't come at once. His plan had seemed perfect to him, meticulously thought out with the utmost care. It seemed to him that a single bite, a touch of what he had mixed in that dish, would be enough for her to feel his contempt, his hatred for her confidence in her inviolability to shatter. The girl continued to eat, unaware that in every movement she made, in every moment of her pleasure, Richard saw a personal insult. To him, her calmness was a challenge, a reminder that people like her were used to their calmness and had always thought themselves invulnerable. It was unbearable. His anger grew stronger by the minute, and he felt helpless against her serenity, against her unwillingness to notice that he was so intent on hurting her. Have you ever noticed how someone we consider an enemy seems completely indifferent to our indignation? There are times when we are consumed by rage and the person is not even aware of what we are experiencing. Sometimes this feeling is stronger than any conflict because it makes us feel small and powerless. Share your thoughts on this in the comments. Your stories help us understand human emotions and motivations more deeply. Richard stood with his hands clenched into fists, his patience growing more and more impatient with each passing second. He expected the poison to show itself instantly, for her face to turn pale, for her face to show anxiety. But it didn't. She continued to eat, smiling, lifting her eyes from time to time and looking somewhere in the hall. There was such a calm confidence in her face that Richard felt humiliated, helpless. His plan, his revenge, his desire, all of it was shattered by her indifference. It seemed to him that she and her confidence were simply mocking him. And then he realized that if the effect didn't come now, he was ready to move on. As the girl continued to eat her dinner, Richard kept his eyes on her. His patience was wearing thin with each passing second, like a crack slowly spreading across glass. It seemed to him that his whole plan had backfired, that his attempt to humiliate her had failed. But suddenly he noticed a subtle change in the girl's face. She stood still for a moment, putting down her fork, and then her hand shook, as if her confidence had left her. Richard felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Finally, his mind raced. He saw her hand reach for a glass of water. She took a few sips, but he could tell by the look on her face that the water didn't help, that the strange feeling that had taken hold of her was growing, slowly but surely making her nervous. The girl frowned, looking around, and her gaze changed. Something new flashed in it, something she probably couldn't explain, but which permeated her with uncertainty. It was fear, tentative and barely perceptible, but it was there, and Richard could see it. She took the fork again, but this time her hand trembled. She put a bite into her mouth, but instead of the pleasure that had been in her eyes at first, there was worry in them now. Her movements no longer had the grace and ease that had made Richard so angry. Now, she looked vulnerable, out of control. It was a sweet moment for him. It felt he'd finally been able to show her that she wasn't as strong as she thought, that her status and her influence wouldn't protect her from what he was up to. Have you ever seen a person who has always been confident suddenly start to lose control? It's like a broken note in a perfectly played melody, awkward, unexpected, but impossible not to notice. Sometimes this change, this moment when confidence gives way to doubt, can't say more than 1,000 words. Tell us in the comments if you know this feeling. Your support helps us make these stories deeper and more real. The girl put aside her fork and put her hand to her chest, as if trying to catch her breath, as shadow appeared on her face, the slight blush replaced by a sickly pallor. She reached for the glass of water again, but this time she drank it slowly, as if afraid that one wrong sip would aggravate her condition. Her gaze, now clouded with anxiety, wandered around the room, looking for something or someone to reassure her that everything was all right. Richard stood in the shadows, shrinking with breathless pleasure. It seemed to him that this moment was his triumph. He saw her face begin to change. Her pride and arrogance began to crumble under the weight of fear. The whole thing seemed to Richard a triumph, almost a culmination of his plan. He watched as the girl tried to remain calm, but her face betrayed everything: tension, fear, anxiety, growing bewilderment. She glanced toward the kitchen, as if unconsciously trying to understand where this growing unease was coming from. But there was only a mist in her eyes, like vulnerability hidden behind impeccable manners. For Richard, it was a victory. Now she knows her place, he thought, feeling the inner tension that had been chasing him all evening gradually subside. And then news began to spread in the air that made him freeze. He heard whispering among the waiters, someone was saying that the girl who was now sitting at the table was the daughter of the Chief Justice of that district. She was not just a rich heiress, but a person with whom no one would risk a conflict. Not a person, but a real person, behind whom stood not only the power, but also the law. Suddenly Richard felt an icy prick of fear that pierced him like a needle, leaving an emptiness inside. Everything he knew about the judge surfaced in his mind. He was a man known for his intransigence, a man who literally lived for justice, retribution, and the law. Not only did he punish criminals, but he fought every injustice with relentless determination. This girl was his daughter, and now, sitting in his restaurant, she was the victim of his secret poisoning. Richard felt a panicky feeling begin to grow inside him, clutching at his chest. All night, he'd seen her as just an object of his hatred, a casual visitor, but now he realized that not only was his anger directed at her, but there was a whole chain of events that could turn against him. This girl might not have known what was happening to her, but her father, the Chief Justice, would not let it go unnoticed. Richard began to imagine how this story would be a disaster for him, how one wrong decision, one moment born of hatred, could ruin his whole life. Have you ever experienced a moment when the realization of a mistake hits you like a wave, when past actions suddenly seem irreversible and the consequences frighteningly real? Sometimes one simple event can change everything, jeopardize everything we've accomplished. Share your stories in the comments. Your experiences help us better uncover the depth of human error and understanding. He tried to suppress the growing sense of dread, but it would not let him go. Everything that had seemed like a triumph was now turning against him. The words of his colleagues, who had spoken of her father in recent days, of his reputation, of how he was known for his ruthlessness toward those who harmed the innocent, echoed in his mind. Richard felt his triumphant moment turn into a nightmare. His heart, which had been beating with anticipation a few minutes ago, now clenched with fear, as if cold steel fingers were squeezing him from the inside. He found it hard to breathe and leaned his hands on the cold metal counter, trying to suppress the panic that gripped him. His mind was filled with thoughts, one more terrifying than the other. He realized that by his action, he had gone against a man who was not to be trifled with. The chief judge was the girl's father, a man who embodied not just power, but the force of law and justice, which could not be avoided. Everything he knew about the Chief Justice flashed before Richard's eyes like a movie. This man feared no one. He was known for his sternness and integrity. His determination to punish those who infringed on justice knew no bounds. He did not accept excuses and did not forgive mistakes. And now, as if by chance, Richard found himself in the path of a man he should never have encountered. He imagined that this judge would not rest until he found the man who dared to poison his daughter. Despair began to flare inside Richard, dark and hopeless, like a deep well into which he had driven himself. He realized that what he had done was not just a reckless act, but a crime, not against someone defenseless, but against one of the most powerful men in the world. He remembered everything he had thought of the girl, her quiet confidence, her inaccessibility, and now the calmness and confidence that had so infuriated him seemed to him signs of her impenetrable security. She was like a person standing under the unbroken protection of her father, and now it seemed unbearably dangerous. Have you ever done an act that seemed like a small thing at first, but you soon realize it was a huge mistake that could change your life? Share your stories, if you like, in the comments. Sometimes we all need to admit our mistakes to realize how valuable moments of considered decisions are. Richard stood in the corner of the kitchen, unable to look away from the hall, where the girl now looked visibly worse, her face pale and sweat beading on her forehead. She was obviously trying not to draw attention to herself, but the people around her were beginning to notice her indisposition. The waiters and a few of the guests were looking at her worriedly, and it was clear to him that it was only a matter of time before someone started asking questions. Panic swept over Richard with renewed vigor. He began to think that the only thing left for him to do now was to find a way to cover up what he had done. He had to do something so that no one would suspect him, so that no one would even think that he was involved, because he was the one who always stayed behind the scenes. That hidden, invisible, simple cook. Richard was standing in the shadows, trying to hide from view, when alarmed voices sounded in the hall. The girl, trembling and pale, slowly lowered her head on her hand, as if trying to cope with dizziness and nausea. Her calm face, which had recently made Richard hate her so much, was now contorted with pain and weakness. She could no longer maintain the image of the confident and unattainable persona that had so irritated him, but instead of satisfaction, he felt only fear, a viscous, lingering fear that filled his mind. One of the guests sitting nearby, noticing that the girl was breathing heavily, jumped up and called the waiters. Within seconds, a group of staff and customers gathered around her, and soon panic spread throughout the room. People were talking over each other. Someone was already calling for an ambulance. Everyone was trying to understand what was going on, how to help the girl whose father was known for his ruthless fairness and concern for his family. Richard felt fear squeezing his heart. He knew what was happening was the result of his malice, and the realization of it made him freeze. His inner voice told him to leave, to disappear from the kitchen, to find a way to hide, but his feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. He saw the waiters scurrying between tables, seeing the girl losing her strength. Her face was dead pale. Her eyes, once lively and bright, were now dull, full of pain and fear. A young waitress came up to him, eyeing him anxiously and almost accusingly. "Richard, this is your kitchen. You know nothing bad can happen in it, right? Is it safe?" He could barely keep from averting his eyes. Feeling panic overwhelm him, he forced himself to nod, answering hoarsely, "Of course it is. That's impossible. We only use the best products." But there was a note of trepidation in his voice that the girl caught. She frowned, looking at him as if she were trying to read his mind. Her suspicion heightened his fear, and he realized that his every look, every wrong word, could give him away. He realized that all these people who were now looking anxiously at the girl could just as easily turn their eyes on him. They might suspect that he, hidden in the shadows of the kitchen, was the cause of her condition. Have you ever been in a situation where the realization of your guilt paralyzes you, deprives you of strength, when every look around you seems to be directed at you and every word, even innocent ones, is reproachful? This feeling, the fear of exposure, irreparable consequences, becomes unbearable, overshadowing everything else. Share your thoughts on this in the comments, because these moments remind us of the fragility of our decisions. Footsteps sounded in the hall, and someone announced that an ambulance was on its way. The people clustered around the girl, doing their best to support her, to help her breathe, to give her water, but she only flailed weakly, her body refusing to obey. Richard knew that if they took her to the hospital, if they tested her, if they found poison, they would start looking for answers. Richard stood there like a hunted animal, trying to keep his composure, though his mind was buzzing with the thought that all this might end in disaster. No sooner had he come to his senses, however, than the manager of the restaurant, Mr. Lawrence, an elderly man with cold, penetrating eyes, approached him. Normally his calmness and authority would have inspired Richard's respect, but now his gaze pierced Richard, and he felt that Mr. Lawrence had come with questions he didn't know how to answer. "Richard," Lawrence said quietly but insistently, moving closer, "tell me, what is going on here? What happened to this girl?" His eyes were fixed on Richard, demanding the truth. Richard felt his throat go dry. He could not at once squeeze out an answer. He knew that Lawrence, a man with an almost intuitive instinct, knew every little thing that went on in the kitchen and in the hall. He was the one who held the restaurant in his hands, and his reputation was built on impeccability and immaculate security. "I don't know," Richard wheezed, pretending to be as stunned as the others. "It's impossible. There's nothing dangerous in our products." But his words sounded uncertain, and Lawrence noticed it. The manager frowned and glared at him even harder. "Richard," he said, lowering his voice so the other employees wouldn't hear them talking, "you're in charge of everything that happens in the kitchen. If anything happens to her, I need to be sure it's not your fault. I can't let the reputation of our establishment suffer, and certainly not if it affects the Chief Justice's family. Do you realize what this means?" The words Chief Justice pierced Richard like a blade. At that moment he realized that his decision to poison the girl was not just a mistake, but the greatest folly, for which he could now pay everything. He saw that Lawrence had no intention of letting him get away with it if anything came to light. Panic, fear of exposure, began to press upon him with renewed vigor. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where a person you obey or respect begins to suspect the worst about you? That feeling burns you, makes you want to hide, disappear. Share your experiences about it in the comments. It's a scary feeling when you realize you could lose trust, disappoint, or lose your reputation forever. Richard tried to assure Lawrence that he had nothing to do with the girl's condition, but the growing concern in the manager's eyes betrayed his suspicions. Richard knew that the reputation of the entire restaurant was at stake. His mind was torn by the realization that one wrong step, one mistake because of his racial hatred, his unreasonable anger, could ruin everything. "I'll check the kitchen myself," Lawrence said at last, giving Richard one last warning glance. "If I find anything suspicious, if this story turns into a scandal, I won't let it go." Lawrence walked off in the direction of the kitchen, and Richard stayed behind, feeling his driven aggression turn to terror and despair. Richard was alone, paralyzed by fear and a sense of impending disaster. Not so long ago, he had felt almost omnipotent, enjoying the thought of how he could shake the girl's confidence with a single decision. But now his power over the situation had collapsed. Her suffering, which at first had given him grim satisfaction, now turned to his own panic. Everything he had built up over the years in that kitchen, his entire reputation, all of it was threatened by one ill-fated burst of hatred. Lawrence went to the kitchen, and Richard had a feeling that the manager would leave no detail unattended. Every movement of Lawrence, every sweep of his arm, every glance seemed to Richard a threat, as if Lawrence knew of his malicious act and was only waiting to find proof. Richard realized that if the jar of powder came to the attention of the manager, if any of his colleagues mentioned that he had worked hard on the girl's dish, suspicion would turn against him. Meanwhile, there was an atmosphere of tense anticipation in the kitchen. Some of the co-workers looked at each other, whispering, and some cast suspicious glances at Richard, as if sensing that he had something to do with what was going on. He saw the young cook, to whom he had once expressed his views, rudely looking at him with undisguised suspicion and even contempt. Richard realized that the people around him also saw his anger and racial prejudice, and though they were silent, he knew that each of them could guess deep down what he was capable of. At that moment, Lawrence returned from the kitchen with a small glass jar in his hand. Richard felt the blood rush to his face. This jar was the proof of his crime, of his hidden hatred and unforgivable mistake. Lawrence held it up for all to see, his face cold and impenetrable. "Richard," he said calmly, but his voice was filled with suspicion and anger, "can you explain why this jar of unknown powder was in your workspace?" Richard frantically tried to think of an answer, but no words came to his mind. He realized that everything was lost, that his whole career, his reputation, was crumbling like ashes. He knew that no explanation could save him now. He wanted to lie, but realized that every word he said would only make his situation worse. Lawrence continued to stare at him, his gaze demanding the truth. Richard's colleagues frowned in anticipation, unknowing that something had happened, and realizing that this was not just a mistake. Richard's hatred, his bias, it all became apparent like a shadow. Suddenly stepping into the light, he saw in the eyes of his colleagues a mixture of fear and disgust. Have you ever felt that one act, one rash decision can turn your whole life upside down? When the people you've worked side by side will start to see you through different eyes. That moment, the moment when the consequences become inescapable, can break a person more than any physical ordeal. Share your thoughts about it in the comments, because such moments often stay with us for a long time. Richard's heart was pounding in a furious rhythm. He realized that all his hatred, all his prejudice, had brought him to this moment of exposure. Lawrence stood across from Richard, holding the unfortunate jar of powder, his gaze full of icy, merciless judgment. Richard had never seen the manager like this in his entire career. His face seemed stone cold, his eyes filled with what could be called disappointment and anger at the same time. Richard's colleagues standing around him cast glances at him, full of fear and implicit judgment. They, too, could not believe that someone who had worked side by side with them for so many years was capable of such an act. Lawrence took a step closer, and Richard felt the icy hand of fear clutching his heart. Desperate thoughts flashed through his mind about how he could escape, how he could justify himself, how he could hide the truth. But with every moment, looking at the steward, he realized that he could say nothing. Lawrence already knew. Everybody knew. Excuses were useless. Richard, Lawrence said quietly, and the calmness of his voice sent a new rush of panic through Richard. Do you realize what you've done? This isn't just a violation. You've allowed your hatred, your dark prejudices, to jeopardize not only her life, but everything we've built here. I would never have thought a man I thought was a professional would do such a thing. Lawrence's words sounded like a judgment. Each one was like a hammer breaking down the protective walls Richard had built around his hatred for so long. He thought his anger toward people he thought didn't deserve to be in his world was his right, his secret. He thought he could do his justice in the shadows, that his racial prejudice was something he could keep inside without fear of repercussions. But now, faced with the inevitable exposure, he realized that his whole plan had backfired on him. All his malice, hidden behind a mask of professionalism, was now revealed, and the whole room witnessed his humiliation. He saw how his colleagues looked at him, saw how their gazes expressed contempt and perhaps even hatred. Have you ever felt that your own behavior, your prejudices, can destroy everything you've been building for years? In such moments, it feels like the world is falling apart, that every little thing in your life has been a mistake leading to this very moment of exposure. If you have a similar experience, if you've ever faced a moment of inevitable punishment for your mistakes, share your feelings in the comments. Richard knew that this was the end. He knew that he could never go back to his old life again, that his reputation was ruined, that his hatred and arrogance had caused his own downfall. The girl he despised so much was lying in the hospital, her condition unknown, but the whole horrible experience was not only her ordeal, but his own tragedy. You know what will happen next, Richard, Lawrence said quietly, his voice almost mournful, but merciless. We won't just lose our reputation. I'll turn all this over to the police. We'll notify her father. You'll be held legally responsible for your actions. And maybe then you'll realize that nothing is more destructive than the hatred you've hidden for so long. The words sounded like a sentence. Richard felt everything inside him crumble. When Lawrence finished his speech, the kitchen was completely silent. Everyone stood, as if mesmerized by this moment when the truth came out, exposing the ugly side of the human soul. Richard could feel his colleagues looking at him, some with disgust, others with outright condemnation. He was not just a cook to them, but a man they had known for years, a man they trusted. Now that trust had been torn to shreds, his image shattered, revealing the emptiness and anger he had hidden for so long. A few minutes later, two policemen entered the room. Their footsteps echoed through the kitchen, each strike on the tile a harbinger of his inevitable fate. They approached Richard, and he realized that this was the end, that now he would no longer be able to hide behind his work, behind the white apron, behind the walls of the kitchen where he had played the role of a professional for so many years. His hands were shaking, and he tried to find some excuse, words that could explain everything that had happened. But the words left him. Nothing could atone for what he had done. One of the policemen with a cold, impassive expression read him his rights. The words sounded like hammer blows, each phrase like another step toward the inevitable. Richard did not resist and knew that resistance would have been futile. He realized that he was caught in a trap he had created for himself. The policeman gestured for him to raise his hands, and Richard felt the cold steel handcuffs snap forcefully onto his wrists. He shuddered, feeling that touch, which symbolized the end of his freedom, the end of the life he had known. As he was led out of the kitchen, he saw the restaurant staff watching him with eyes full of contempt. No one approached him. No one said a word, not even those who had once considered him a friend, or at least a fellow employee. All the glances directed at him said one thing: he no longer existed for them. He had become for them a symbol of everything that was wrong, the embodiment of the dark prejudices that lurked beneath the mask of respect and professionalism. When they reached the restaurant's exit, Richard noticed that there was a crowd of guests and other employees, as well as casual passers-by. People were already whispering, discussing his arrest, spreading rumors to each other about what he had done. Some had taken pictures of him on their phones. Some were whispering jeeringly that that's what he should do. Richard felt as if everyone was looking at him and everyone saw him not just as a criminal, but as a monster. He was ashamed, but at the same time he was consumed by rage. He hated these people, despised them for looking at him with such ease, as if he were a caged animal. Have you ever felt that every glance around you penetrates you, as if it sees everything you have tried to hide, when one moment can turn you into a laughingstock, an object of hatred and disgust? In such moments, we feel defenseless, as if the world has come crashing down on us without a single chance for forgiveness. Share your thoughts about this in the comments, because sometimes our mistakes seem so terrible to us that it seems as if the whole world is ready to judge us. As he was led, handcuffed, to his car, Richard felt his world crumble completely. His whole life, his efforts, his career, his reputation, all of it had been destroyed because of one unbridled burst of hatred. When the police officers put Richard in the car and slammed the door behind him, he felt his world finally fall into darkness. In the small, cramped space of the patrol car, he was overcome by a feeling of impenetrable emptiness. He realized that he had spent his entire life trying to hide behind the walls of the kitchen, to mask his hatred with professionalism, but in the end, it had all led to his downfall. His career, the respect he had once achieved, people's trust, it was all gone in an instant. He looked at his hands, shackled in cold handcuffs, and remembered how he used to create his dishes with those hands, diligently and painstakingly, proud of his craftsmanship. But now the hands that had once created had become the hands of a criminal. His every action, his every deed to prove his supposed superiority, eventually became the chains that shackled his life. A feeling of devastation and deep regret settled inside Richard. He realized that his hatred, based on his prejudices, had led to terrible consequences. The girl who to him had been merely an image of a stranger, an undeserved guest in his world, had turned out to be a person with living feelings, the daughter of a father who must now be gripped by despair and pain. He no longer saw her as a symbol, he saw her as a human being whom he had caused untold pain. Her life and health were now threatened only because of his racist delusion, because of his desire to show that she did not belong here. Have you ever wondered how often we look at people through the lens of prejudice, without thinking about who they really are? How often we allow our inner fears and stereotypes to ruin not only the lives of others, but our own as well. Share your thoughts on this in the comments. After all, moments like these remind us that aggression rooted in our hearts always leads to destruction. Richard knew he could find no forgiveness, not from those who had seen his fall, not from the girl's family, and certainly not from himself. He realized that all his excuses, all the justified prejudices he tried to hide his hatred with, were just his own weakness, his fear that someone might be his equal. And now that fear, that aggression hidden behind the scenes in the kitchen, had become his judges. As the car drove off, Richard glanced at the streets they were passing. He saw people, ordinary passers-by who didn't know him or his story, but who were so much like the people they hated. They went about their business, lived their lives, and each had their own concerns, their own feelings, their own stories. And he, Richard, only now realized that everyone, even those he considered outsiders, had a right to be here, to be equal. This lesson, a lesson that cost him everything he had, was both his punishment and his awakening. Dear viewers, thank you for watching this story to the end. We are very interested in your opinion. What do you think about Richard's fate? Have you ever experienced racism or prejudice in your life? How did you deal with it? Please share your stories in the comments. Your thoughts and experiences are incredibly valuable to us. Every word you share helps us explore such complex and important topics in greater depth. We make these stories just for you, and your support gives us the strength to create new projects. If you liked this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. You are an integral part of the channel for us, and we are eternally grateful that you are with us. We wish you a good day, and may you have more kindness and understanding in your life.